So the second group is going to talk about protecting the ecosystems in the Rockies. Those are mountains in the western part of America, on the other side of the Hudson River. I think there's a whole country over there, as near as I can tell. We try as hard as we can to focus here, except when we're doing one of Professor Palmer's groups. So I'm basically just delaying until everybody sits down, in case you haven't figured that out yet. If I had a banjo, I would play that. In any event, we're going to hear from our next briefer. Jonathan, why don't you take it away?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Lesser, and I'll be presenting to you today on the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act of 2019. I'd like to thank my whole team for their past 6 months of fantastic work. Special thanks to Beryl and Arafili, our fall management team, and our faculty advisor, Dr. Matt Palmer. The Northern Rockies bioregion contains some of the last large tracts of wild expanses in the lower 48 states. The region encompasses parts of 5 states: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. There's an extremely high proportion of federal land in the region, and the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act would dramatically expand the current extent of protections, shown in yellow, to the extent in dark green. The region is home to a plethora of native plants and wildlife, like this black bear. It's also a popular destination for recreation and tourism, and it's rich in natural resources like minerals, timber, oil, and natural gas. Unfortunately, the extraction of these resources has led to polluted lands and waterways, eroded soils, fragmented habitats, and generally damaged wildlife populations. These are long-term ecological issues. The Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act would seek to address these issues through 4 designations. The act would create over 23 million acres of wilderness. This is the federal government's strongest land protection, and it's reserved for roadless lands that have retained their wild, untrammeled character despite surrounding development. The act also designates over 1,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers, the nation's strongest protection for waterways. Our program focuses on these next 2 designations because they require the most time, money, and people. The Act designates around 3 million acres of biological connecting corridors. These areas act as bridges between ecosystems, facilitating the flow of wildlife populations and genes. The Act also designates around 1 million acres of wildland recovery areas. This acknowledges that parts of the landscape have degraded significantly, and restoration measures are necessary to restore their wild character. So let's take a look at the implementation of one corridor in particular. This is the Sapphire Mountains corridor in western Montana. It's about 120,000 acres in size. And as we can see, there's a complex mosaic of land ownership. There's a high proportion of federal land, shown in light green, but there are also large pieces which are state or locally owned, shown in pink, sovereign tribal land, shown in dark blue, and privately owned land, striped in white. The current wilderness within the corridor is very sparse, and the large amounts of wilderness in the area make up the hearts of the 2 ecosystems, the Salmon-Selway ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, that the corridor is designed to connect. These ecosystems are home to populations of bears, elk, cougars, all of which would benefit from connection. For example, they would be able to find more mates than they otherwise would. So the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act would expand the habitat within the corridor, but the corridor implementation team would have the task of engaging with these various landowners and managers to facilitate contiguous movement of the wildlife populations. So for example, in this area circled in red, a large proportion of the private land is owned by the Nature Conservancy. and there are a number of individual landowners as well. So the implementation team would engage with those individual landowners to negotiate things like land swaps or acquisitions or other kinds of cooperative agreements. And they would work with the Nature Conservancy to review their conservation policies and make sure that they're in line with the goals of the corridor. So this really illustrates the primary challenge of corridor implementation, which is working with private landowners or other types of landowners to take down barriers, remove infrastructure, and create these open spaces that wildlife can roam through without human conflict. Okay, so our program hires people in the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management because these are the federal agencies that manage the federal land within the corridors now. And we allocate them a budget of $64 million annually to engage with the landowners and negotiate acquisitions and exchanges. Okay, let's take a look at the other major component of the bill, which is implementing restoration areas. This is the Betty Baptiste project in northern Montana. It encompasses part of the east bank of the Hungry Horse Reservoir. It's an 1,800-acre restoration area, which is about twice the size of Central Park. This map provides an example of the kind of work the restoration implementation team would do, identifying various techniques for restoration and mapping out how they would be applied to the landscape. The Betty Baptiste project area might look like uninterrupted wilderness to the untrained eye. This photo from the implementation team on the ground, I think, illustrates some of the thin and dead forest that's resulted from decades of timber extraction in the area. So the restoration team would close off sections of the forest to the public for periods of time. They would plan those schedules. They would map out erosion controls like this boundary along a trail or similar boundaries along riverbanks. They would plan reforestation and other vegetation restoration, as well as invasive species removal. And they would patiently wait and monitor the forest over time to make sure that the vegetation is restoring and the wildlife are returning. So the restoration areas in total designated by the bill is about 600 times the area of the Betty Baptiste project. So our program allocates an annual budget of $257 million to complete those goals. Okay, the last component of our program is assessment and monitoring. This is crucial for evaluating the success of the program. Ecological indicators tie what's happening on the ground back to the goals of the Act, like protecting native species and water quality, connecting fragmented wildlife populations, restoring vegetation, and removing contaminants. Now, some indicators, like the quantity of land purchased, only require sound data management, but others, like monitoring wildlife movements and the distribution of vegetation, require satellite data and remote sensing. This radar image of the Eastern Front Range of the Rockies in Montana was stitched together with satellite data and provides information on the composition of the land, which is crucial for land management. Now, any remotely collected data also needs to be verified with on-the-ground local sampling. Our program hires assessment and monitoring staff to manage contracts for this kind of field assessment. So those staff members, together with GIS specialists to manage the satellite and remote data, make up our assessment and monitoring implementation team, and we allocate them a budget of $1.5 million to complete their work annually. So to coordinate all of this knowledge generated by the implementation teams, the Act mandates the creation of an interagency team which will be composed of 50% public sector representatives and 50% private sector representatives. The team will be chaired by a new Northern Rockies bioregion executive director, and its activities will be managed by the director's staff. The remainder of the public sector representatives will be one from each of the federal agencies that manage lands within the bioregion, as well as one from each of the 5 states that manage lands within the bioregion. The private sector representatives will be in part people from conservation organizations and in part people from industry, including recreation and tourism and the extractive industries. So the implementation teams are really at the heart of our program. They manage all of the work related to the 4 designations, as well as the continuous assessment and monitoring of their work. They report on their findings back to the interagency team, who make recommendations on how to further fulfill the goals of the Act going into the future. Rachel Carson pointed out that only one species has acquired significant power to alter the nature of the world. Humanity has already left its mark on the bioregion, but this act represents a step towards harmonizing the relationship between people and the Northern Rockies. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
So the budget allocation for land acquisition was $64 million, which is a very good amount. It's a nice incentive for private sector sales. But I am curious if there is any potential or authorization for eminent domain.
Well, in our program design, we did not consider eminent domain as a method to create these corridors. As you might imagine, it's a controversial policy decision, and we think that engaging with the community and looking at, we got that number from past budgets towards land acquisitions by the U.S. Forest Service, and so we think that that's sufficient.
So as someone who used to live in one of these corridors you're talking about, I would actually argue the opposite. I think that's nowhere close to the money required. These are places that in general only have a few pieces of private land, and those pieces of private land are very valuable. So $67 million or whatever the number is, that's literally 3 or 4 ranches. That's not enough. I mean, the map scale is quite large to actually buy enough of a corridor to make it a functional corridor. Oh, and there's not enough employees, I would argue, to make it very attractive locally, because the way to sell this to the local people, like my family who lives there, is to actually have more jobs. Because I can tell you, if I go home and work, the best job I have is working at a gas station. So job creation would be a really good way to make people actually want this place, or this program, excuse me.
So we would hope that that our program would create a number of jobs in the recreation and tourism industry, and hopefully that would offset a number of the jobs that might be lost due to the limitations on extractive industry. Also, I'd like to point out that the budget for acquisitions is only one part of the way that these corridors would be implemented. Hopefully, cooperative agreements with the landowners would be the primary method. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to first, that was a great presentation. I want to remind the faculty and everybody that what the groups are doing is a management simulation based on a piece of legislation that they didn't pass and that they didn't propose. It was proposed by somebody in the Congress. And so all of these projects are constrained in that way. Even if they may not be the most realistic projects, they're the ones that we're doing over these 2 semesters.